Right, so Benjamin Netanyahu has built a career convincing Israelis and Washington and much of the West as well that only he could keep the country safe and keep the country's extremists in check. Then, of course, he went into coalition with many of them, didn't he? And then soon learned that they are actually in control of Netanyahu and not the other way around. You see, just yesterday that got proven to a point that may now have put Netanyahu's career on borrowed time. As JD Vance met him in Jerusalem, the US currently against any form of annexation, Israel's Knesset voted 25 to 24 to extend Israeli sovereignty to the occupied West Bank. The bill, drafted by far-right Jewish puritan and Noam Party leader Avi Maoz, passed despite Netanyahu's personal order to block it, and even picked up support from within Likud, Netanyahu's own party. It was the first formal legislative nod to annexation since 1967, carried out whilst Israel's chief ally was still in the room. Vance called it an insult, but it was more than that. It was proof that the Prime Minister who sold himself as master of control now commands nothing. Not his cabinet, not his coalition, and certainly not the country whose future he insists only he can protect. Right, so yesterday the Israeli Knesset voted by a margin of 25 to 24 to give preliminary approval to a bill extending Israeli sovereignty to the occupied West Bank. The proposal, tabled by Avi Maoz of the far-right Noam Party, received support from within Benjamin Netanyahu's own Likud ranks at that. Amongst those who defied the Prime Minister's instruction to oppose it was Yuli Edelstein, a former Knesset speaker and a long-time party heavyweight. That single act of rebellion, while legally only a preliminary reading, exposed what months of coalition strain had already made clear, though. Israel's government no longer operates under Netanyahu's control. The vote took place as US Vice President JD Vance was in Jerusalem discussing the Gaza ceasefire. Within hours of his meetings, Israel's parliament voted in the opposite direction. Vance called the decision an insult and a political stunt. A lot of people might regard Vance himself in the same way, though I think the word they might use only rhymes with stunt. But for Washington, it was open defiance. For Netanyahu, it was humiliation broadcast live. What had once been a managed coalition has become a coalition of managers. The extremists Netanyahu empowered to secure his majority are now steering the state. They're running the show now. The bill's language left no ambiguity over that. It declared that the laws, jurisdiction, administration and sovereignty of the State of Israel shall apply to all settlement areas in the West Bank. If completed through 3 further readings, the measure would erase the legal boundary separating Israel from territory recognised by the United Nations as occupied Palestinian land. Every nation who has recognised Palestinian statehood, especially those who have done so recently, has a duty to oppose this vociferously. Netanyahu's office had issued direct instructions to coalition members to block it. They disregarded those orders. Edelstein's support was especially significant. He represents Likud's institutional wing, rarely challenges party discipline, so his defection in this vote confirmed that Netanyahu's authority within Likud itself has fallen apart, let alone across the rest of the coalition. It's worth also mentioning Avi Maoz at this point as well. Although Maoz holds only 1 seat in the 120-member Knesset, he is Noam's sole representative. His ability to advance such a consequential bill exposes a paralysis at the top of government. Noam's platform is explicitly theocratic. It seeks to anchor state law in halakhic norms, opposing LGBTQ rights, for example, and civil marriage. It rejects what it calls foreign liberal influences in public education. It is Jewish puritanism, and it is incredibly regressive. Maoz resigned his deputy ministerial post in 2023 after protests over his attempts to control external education programs, yet his leverage has seemingly grown rather than diminished. The fact that a single ultra-religious Puritan could table and pass even at first reading a bill extending Israeli sovereignty over occupied territory while the Prime Minister of the day pleaded for restraint underlines the vacuum of authority around Netanyahu now. The coalition's extremists no longer need numbers to govern, they need only Netanyahu's fear of losing them. The vote's timing magnified the damage. While Netanyahu met the American delegation, the chamber delivered a 1-vote endorsement of annexation. That act undermined Washington's most explicit red line and illustrated the power of Israel's far-right bloc now. It was the first formal legislative approval of annexation since 1967, a symbolic step towards dismantling the two-state framework in law rather than just in rhetoric. The measure now sits before the Knesset's Foreign Affairs and Defence Committee. Even without any further readings, Its passage thus far sets a precedent. It normalises annexation as legitimate state business and signals to the bureaucracy that resistance is no longer expected. Netanyahu's inability to contain his own coalition is structural now. Itamar Ben-Gvir, the head of Otzma Yehudit and the Minister for National Security, probably the most far-right parliamentarian in the whole of the Knesset, has repeatedly issued ultimatums to Netanyahu. On the 10th of this month, he warned that unless the government advanced his death penalty bill within the next 3 weeks, his party would stop voting with the coalition. And he coupled that demand with a threat to resign if Hamas was not completely dismantled in Gaza. Both statements are on record. Who is really in charge, therefore? At the same time, Bezalel Smotrich, the finance minister and the leader of religious Zionism, extended his authority over the civil administration, the body managing the occupied territories itself, because he's in charge of that. Through administrative orders, he assumed control of planning and construction approvals in settlements, functions previously held by the Defence Ministry, and nothing was done to stop him. That quiet bureaucratic takeover has allowed settlement expansion to accelerate regardless of legislative procedure. These two ministers hold opposite levers, therefore, in effect. Ben-Gvir can collapse the coalition by abstaining. Smotrich can do that too. But Smotrich can also implement annexation without a vote. Netanyahu depends on both to stay in power and out of court. The arrangement leaves him hostage to their agendas, and they know it. His office attempts to project stability, no longer convincing the Israeli public or foreign allies, but when even a single representative party can now get business passed, he really is in a lot of trouble. The ideological colonization of Israel's institutions is most visible inside its security agencies now, apart from national security, which Ben-Gvir is in charge of. For example, the newly appointed Shin Bet chief David Zini has now instructed staff to stop using the term West Bank and instead refer exclusively to Judea and Samaria. According to multiple officials present, he interrupted a briefing to say, "What West Bank? Delete that term from your vocabulary." That change is more than linguistic, though. West Bank is the legal term used in United Nations resolutions, the International Court of Justice advisory opinion of last year, and Israeli military orders since 1967. Judea and Samaria is a biblical designation used by the settler movement and religious nationalists, the like of Smotrich. By enforcing the latter, the Shin Bet's leadership replaced the lexicon of international law with the lexicon of theology. For an agency historically defined by pragmatic intelligence work, that shift represents an institutional shift. The distinction between security policy and religious narrative no longer exists anymore, apparently. And once state organs adopt ideological language in defiance of legislative norms both inside and beyond Israel, then ideology guides their interpretation of threats, of jurisdiction, and even citizenship itself. Netanyahu's silence on Zini's directive was telling as well. A decade ago, he might have cautioned against such overt politicization. A year ago, he was at war, basically, with the then head of Shin Bet, Ronan Bar. Yet now, confronting the far right risks losing his government, and with it, what passes for his legal immunity. No wonder Netanyahu's wife is now publicly demanding in the press that the charges against her husband be dropped. The writing is frankly on the wall for him at this point. The United States remains Israel's principal ally and largest military donor, yet its influence has rarely looked weaker than it does now. During Vance's visit, Netanyahu's office privately relayed Washington's opposition to annexation to Smotrich. The message confirmed by Israeli broadcaster Kan was clear. The US does not want Israel to impose sovereignty over the West Bank. Smotrich ignored it. The bill went to a vote, and he voted along with it. The image that followed, the American vice president describing the decision as an insult while still on Israeli soil, just captured the diplomatic rupture that's been decades in the making. US administrations of both main parties have warned successive Israeli governments against annexation. Netanyahu's predecessors at least postponed or disguised such moves. His coalition no longer bothers. They want all the Palestine seized, and they want it now, and blow to what anyone else says or thinks, be that Netanyahu or Donald Trump. For Washington, this spectacle is absolutely humiliating. For Netanyahu, though, it's lethal. His long-cultivated brand as the only Israeli leader who could manage relations with America survived repeated conflicts and policy disputes. It could not survive visible impotence, though. The far right has demonstrated to Israelis and Americans alike that Netanyahu's word carries no weight inside his own government anymore. In July of last year, the International Court of Justice concluded that Israel's presence in the Palestinian territories had no legal validity, and that measures aimed at permanent annexation breached the UN Charter. The UN Human Rights Office described the situation as a flagrant breach of international law and urged states not to recognise or assist in sustaining it. Therefore, this Knesset vote directly contravenes those findings. Applying Israeli civil law to settlements would formalise territorial acquisition by force, an act prohibited under the Fourth Geneva Convention and the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. In the hours following the vote, Hamas released a statement condemning the frenzied attempts to annex West Bank territory, describing the legislation as null and void and explicitly referencing the ICJ's 2024 advisory opinion. The group appealed to the United Nations, the Arab League, the Organisation of Islamic Cooperation as well to intervene. So the shift was significant. Hamas using the vocabulary of international law, not militant defiance, and Israel's response to that was silence. The government offered no legal justification beyond the argument that the bill was merely procedural, yet the symbolism was enough to deepen Israel's isolation. Every allied capital that acknowledges the ICJ's authority must now reconcile continued cooperation with Israel's direct defiance of that ruling. Diplomatic consequences have already begun to surface. The United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, both signatories of the Abraham Accords, expressed formal concern, calling the vote a dangerous escalation. European diplomats have warned that full annexation could trigger suspension of preferential trade terms that treat the occupied territories as separate from Israel. In Washington, senior legislators from both parties described the move as reckless. Netanyahu's problem is not simply foreign anger, though, but visible powerlessness. It's his biggest problem, I would suggest. US administrations may continue arms deliveries, but their confidence in his leadership is collapsing, and they look all the weaker for continuing to send the goods, whilst being treated with increasing contempt by Israel's far right. Domestically, this perception of drift is already visible in the polling. Surveys by Channel 12 News a couple of weeks ago put Netanyahu's approval rating at roughly a third of voters, his lowest level in 2 years, with support amongst secular Israelis particularly weak, apparently. Israeli broadcasters, including Ynet and Can 11, have reported unease within Likud ranks over the economic and diplomatic consequences of the annexation push, with several senior figures warning privately that Israel's international isolation is deepening. Netanyahu's reliable base now lies mainly amongst the ultra-religious and the nationalist factions that view him as politically useful, but ultimately as expendable too. And Netanyahu, of course, remains on trial for bribery and fraud and breach of trust. The proceedings have stalled as he finds excuses to avoid the courtroom. He's got a bad cold, he's got a bad chest, or bombing Gaza during a ceasefire. But it hasn't ended, it hasn't gone away, and it's not going to go away. His immunity, such as it is, depends entirely on remaining Prime Minister. If his coalition collapses, there will be no avoiding it. Annexation legislation therefore places him in an impossible position. To stop it would trigger rebellion and certain loss of office. To advance it invites international legal consequences beyond those he already faces. The International Criminal Court already holds open files on settlement expansions, not to mention an arrest warrant on his head. Formal annexation can be interpreted as evidence of intent, which is a critical threshold in criminal law. This is the paradox defining Netanyahu's rule now. Every tactic that once protected him now endangers him. The coalition structure that ensured parliamentary survival has become the mechanism of his downfall now. The legal system he weakened to delay accountability may yet become the venue that delivers it. Israel's current government represents the completion of a process that began with the 2023-24 judicial overhaul, which curtailed the Supreme Court's ability to strike down unconstitutional laws. That reform removed the last institutional barrier separating state policy from ideological will. Therefore, the annexation drive is not an aberration, it's the logical extension of that project. The far right has moved from pressuring the state to becoming it. The Shin Bet's language order, the civil administration's capture by Smotrich, and the Knesset's preliminary vote all reflect a single trajectory: the transformation of temporary occupation into permanent doctrine. Netanyahu once prided himself on balancing the extremes: secular against religious, Washington against the settlers, war against diplomacy. That model no longer functions. The forces he balanced have combined against him now. The settlers occupy not just land, but institutions. Theocratic language now shapes security briefings. The legislative branch legislates theology as well. Annexation carries consequences beyond Netanyahu's personal fate. It undermines Israel's claim to democratic legitimacy. A state that enacts permanent sovereignty over a population it denies citizenship to cannot call itself a democracy any longer. The move also destabilises regional diplomacy. Arab governments that normalised relations under the Abraham Accords now face domestic pressure to reconsider those. Public opinion across the Arab world is overwhelmingly opposed to annexation, and leaders who ignore that sentiment risk political unrest themselves. In Europe, lawmakers are debating whether continued arms exports and trade preferences are legally defensible under the ICJ opinion. Annexation would make the distinction between Israel and the occupied territories untenable. For the United States, the crisis exposes the limits of its own foreign policy doctrine. Washington cannot champion a rules-based international order while its closest ally violates the same rules, seemingly over and over again without consequence. That's why the US are so against this move. They themselves are absolutely stuffed beyond all doubt if they continue to support such a state. So yesterday's Knesset vote was not just another internal dispute. It was the moment the Israeli government admitted, through action, that Netanyahu no longer commands it, that Netanyahu is no longer in charge. Every subsequent development, the Shin Bet's rewording order, Ben-Gvir's ultimatums, Smotrich's administrative annexations, and the public reprimands from the United States all reinforce that reality. The political consequences are already measurable. Likud's internal unity has fractured. International confidence in Netanyahu's leadership has evaporated. His dependence on ideological partners ensures that every decision either weakens his position or accelerates Israel's isolation. His collapse will likely come not through resignation or election defeat, but through attrition now. A steady draining of authority until even allies conclude that his presence endangers the state's survival. And there have been headlines in numerous press articles alluding to just that point. The man who built his career promising to control the extremists now survives only by obeying them. For 30 years, Benjamin Netanyahu's power rested on a single illusion, that he alone could manage Israel's contradictions. He could promise annexation to the settlers while promising restraint to Washington, promise security to the army while trading concessions to the ultra-Orthodox, and promise stability to the public while governing through permanent crisis. The annexation vote has shattered that completely. It showed a prime minister without control, a government without discipline, and a state drifting towards permanent illegality. Israel is now legislating the end of the two-state framework in front of the world's eyes. Its leader, once seen as the master strategist of Israeli politics, has been reduced to a spectator. Netanyahu can neither stop annexation nor can he survive it. The system he engineered to keep himself indispensable has made him irrelevant. When the Knesset scoreboard lit up, 25 green lights, 24 red, it did more than record a vote. It marked the moment Israel's longest-serving leader became a passenger in the vehicle he built to stay in power. The illusion is over. Netanyahu is finished. What remains is the reckoning, whatever shape that takes. Of course, it isn't just Netanyahu whose fate may be sealed by the actions of the Israeli far right, but the state of Israel itself potentially. And it's not just me spouting off about such things that thinks that way, but so many in Israel too, as many of the people who live there are choosing to no longer do so, fleeing the country in ever-increasing numbers until, who is left? Just an increasingly extremist fringe? Get all the details of that story in this video recommendation here as your suggested next watch. Please do also hit like, share and subscribe if you haven't done so already, so as to ensure you don't miss out on all new daily content, as well as spreading the word and helping to support the channel at the same time, which is very much appreciated. Holding power to account for ordinary working class people, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.